You are sick. Not dramatically sick, just unwell enough that something needs to be done. You go to see a doctor. He examines you, says little, and hands you a small bottle. The liquid inside is dark. There is no label telling you what it contains. There is no list of ingredients. No dosage instructions. No warnings. He simply tells you to take some when you need it. You trust him. You have no other choice. You go home, take the medicine, and it works. At least it seems to work. The pain fades. You sleep. You feel better. But you never find out what was in that bottle. This was not unusual. For most of American history, this was simply how medicine worked. Doctors made their own remedies. Pharmacists mixed their own compounds. Traveling salesmen sold their own cures. And no one, not the government, not a licensing board, not a single oversight body required anyone to tell you what you were taking. So what were doctors actually giving people? To understand what medicine looked like in 19th century America, you have to let go of everything you associate with modern healthcare. There were no hospitals in the modern sense. There were no standardized treatments. There were no licensing requirements that meant anything in practice. A man could call himself a doctor, set up an office, and begin seeing patients with nothing more than a basic knowledge of anatomy and a collection of remedies he had assembled himself. Medical schools existed, but they varied enormously in quality. Some had rigorous programs. Many did not. A student might graduate after attending just a single year of lectures. Hands-on clinical training was rare. The gap between what a doctor knew and what he confidently prescribed was often very wide. When you went to see one of these men, the visit was brief. He would observe you, perhaps feel your pulse, look at your tongue, ask about your symptoms. Then he would reach for one of his remedies. He might mix something on the spot. He might hand you a bottle he had already prepared. Either way, the transaction was built on trust, not transparency. You trusted that he knew what he was doing. You trusted that what he gave you would help. And in many cases, you felt better afterward, though whether that was because of the medicine or simply because your body healed on its own was impossible to know. This is the world American medicine existed in for most of the 1800s. A world without labels, without guarantees, without regulation of any kind. The question of what was actually inside these remedies brings us to a surprisingly short list of ingredients. Opium was everywhere. It was legal, widely available, and considered a routine part of medical treatment. Doctors prescribed it for pain, for coughing, for diarrhea, for anxiety, for sleeplessness, and for dozens of conditions in between. It was extracted into a liquid form called laudanum, a mixture of opium dissolved in alcohol, and it was one of the most commonly used medicines in the country. Laudanum was not treated as a dangerous substance. It was sold in pharmacies. It was given to women suffering from what doctors called nervous complaints. It was given to children to stop them from crying. Mothers kept it in the house the way families today might keep aspirin in a cabinet. The idea that it could be addictive, that it was reshaping the brain chemistry of everyone who took it regularly, was not yet part of the public conversation. Alcohol was similarly embedded in medicine. Many remedies were alcohol-based, not simply because alcohol helped dissolve other compounds, but because it produced an effect on its own. Patients felt warmth, relief, relaxation. They reported improvement. In an era when a large portion of the population also belonged to temperance movements that opposed drinking, alcohol-based medicines gave people a way to consume it without acknowledging what they were doing. Some of the most popular medicines of the era were more than 30% alcohol by volume. Cocaine entered American medicine in the 1880s and was initially received with genuine scientific enthusiasm. Sigmund Freud wrote positively about its potential. American physicians prescribed it for fatigue, for depression, and as a local anesthetic. Coca-Cola, in its original formulation, contained a small amount of cocaine derived from coca leaves. This was not a secret. It was considered a feature. There were also mercury-based compounds, arsenic preparations, and herbal mixtures of varying potency. Doctors used what they had, and what they had was largely unregulated, unstudied, and untested in any modern sense. None of this means every doctor was reckless. Many were genuinely trying to help their patients using the knowledge available to them. But the tools they were working with were blunt, unpredictable, and in some cases far more powerful than anyone fully understood. Alongside the remedies that doctors prepared themselves, an enormous commercial market was growing. Patent medicines, also called proprietary medicines, were bottled products sold directly to the public. The name is somewhat misleading. Most of them were not actually patented. The word patent in this context referred to something closer to a trade secret. Manufacturers kept their formulas private and sold their products under invented names that promised remarkable results. These products filled the shelves of general stores across the country. They were advertised in newspapers. Traveling salesmen brought them to small towns that had no doctor nearby. By the middle of the 19th century, patent medicines had become one of the largest advertising categories in American print media. The names were designed to inspire confidence. Soothing syrup, vegetable compound, restorative bitters, golden medical discovery. The labels were carefully worded. They made claims that stopped just short of specific medical promises, but left the reader with a clear impression that this product could cure nearly anything. What the labels did not include was any list of ingredients. Consumers had no way to know what they were purchasing. A bottle of soothing syrup might be mostly alcohol. Tonic for tired women might contain a significant amount of opium. A remedy sold as a safe herbal preparation might include substances that were genuinely dangerous in repeated doses. The buyer had only the marketing copy to go on, and the marketing copy said whatever would sell the product. Some of the most successful patent medicine companies ran massive advertising campaigns. They printed almanacs, distributed free samples, plastered their names on barns and fences along rural roads. The market was enormous, and competition was fierce. The product that promised the most, and did so in the most reassuring language, tended to win. The people who ran these businesses were not all cynical fraudsters. Some genuinely believed their products worked, but the absence of any requirement to test, prove, or disclose meant that there was no mechanism for separating the useful from the useless, or the useless from the genuinely harmful. The problems with this system were real, and they accumulated slowly over decades. Addiction was widespread, and it was largely invisible. People who became dependent on laudanum or morphine, a more concentrated derivative of opium, often had no idea what had happened to them. They knew they needed their medicine. They knew they felt unwell without it. But the concept of opioid dependency as a medical condition was not yet fully understood, and the stigma that did exist made it difficult for people to speak openly about what they were experiencing. Women were particularly affected. Laudanum was frequently prescribed to women for conditions grouped under the broad category of female complaints, a term that covered everything from menstrual pain to anxiety to general unhappiness with the conditions of their lives. Some women took laudanum daily for years. The medicine helped manage their symptoms. It also changed who they were and made stopping it extremely difficult. Children were given opium-containing preparations routinely. Products sold specifically for infants marketed to calm teething pain or stop excessive crying contained measurable amounts of opiates. Parents gave these products in good faith because they had no way to know what was in them. The results were sometimes fatal. Overdoses happened. Sometimes accidentally, because a patient had no idea how potent a remedy was. Sometimes in circumstances that were harder to classify. With no standard dosing, no warning labels, and no way to know what a product actually contained, the margin between a useful dose and a dangerous one was invisible. There were also people who were harmed not by the active ingredients but by contaminants. Without manufacturing standards, products could be prepared under conditions that introduce bacteria, lead, or other toxic materials into the final compound. The buyer had no recourse and no way to investigate. This uncertainty sat at the center of the entire system. People were taking substances, everyday substances that were altering their bodies and their minds with no informed understanding of what those substances were. The trust that medicine required was real, but the information that should have supported that trust simply did not exist. By the end of the 19th century, voices were beginning to push back. Harvey Washington Wiley was a chemist working for the United States Department of Agriculture. He had spent years studying the food and drug supply and had become increasingly concerned about what he found. Preservatives of uncertain safety. Adulterated foods. Medicines that contained nothing like what their labels claimed. He was convinced that consumers deserved to know what they were consuming, and he spent the better part of 2 decades working toward legislation that would require exactly that. The muckraking journalism of the era helped build public support. Journalists were exposing the conditions in meatpacking plants, the practices of industrial food manufacturers, and the contents of popular patent medicines. Samuel Hopkins Adams published a series of articles in 1905 titled The Great American Fraud, which examined the patent medicine industry in detail. He named specific products. He published laboratory analyses of their contents. He showed readers that what they were buying was often not what they thought it was. The series reached a wide audience and generated significant public concern. Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle, published in 1906, was aimed at exposing labor conditions in the meatpacking industry, but its vivid descriptions of contaminated food horrified readers and added momentum to the reform effort. That same year, Congress passed the Pure Food and Drug Act. President Theodore Roosevelt signed it into law on June 30, 1906. The law did not immediately transform American medicine, but it established something that had never existed before, a legal framework requiring that certain foods and drugs meet minimum standards and that their labels not be false or misleading. It created a mechanism for federal oversight of the food and drug supply. It was the first meaningful step toward the system of regulation that Americans now live under. The Wiley Act, as it was sometimes called, targeted adulteration and misbranding specifically. Product could not be sold with a false label. Product could not be diluted with inferior substances without disclosure. These were limited requirements by modern standards, but in the context of what had come before, they represented a significant shift in what the government believed it had the authority and the obligation to do. The years following 1906 brought gradual changes. Manufacturers who had built entire businesses on vague labeling and hidden formulas were forced to adapt. Some products disappeared. Others reformulated, quietly removing the opium or alcohol that had made them effective, or at least produced the feeling of effectiveness, and tried to survive on whatever was left. Harrison Narcotics Tax Act of 1914 brought further restrictions, requiring registration and taxation of anyone producing or distributing opium and cocaine. It did not make these substances illegal outright, but it dramatically reduced their casual availability. The era in which a doctor could freely prescribe morphine for a headache, or a pharmacist could sell cocaine preparations over the counter, began to close. Labeling requirements expanded. The expectation that a consumer had a right to know what was in a product, a concept that had barely existed before 1906, became increasingly embedded in law and in public expectation. The idea that medicine should be tested, that its claims should be provable, that its contents should be disclosed, slowly became the standard rather than the exception. Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act of 1938 strengthened oversight considerably, in part as a response to a disaster in which a poorly tested pharmaceutical product killed over 100 people. The legislation required that new drugs be proven safe before they could be sold. The framework for modern drug approval began to take shape. None of this happened quickly or completely. Regulation is always incomplete. The process of understanding what substances do to the human body is ongoing and imperfect. But the distance between the medicine of 1870 and the medicine of 1940 was enormous. And it was covered not by scientific progress alone, but by a fundamental change in what society decided people had a right to know. The bottle a doctor handed you in 1870 contained something real. It had an effect on your body. You felt it working, or you felt something you interpreted as working. But the name on the outside told you nothing. The contents were unknown to you. The decision about what you needed and what you received belonged entirely